So yeah, welcome to session 17 on exploring decoloniality in peacebuilding. I think we're waiting for other people to get into the virtual room. So we are happy that Duncan and Leia is able to join us this afternoon. I hope all of you virtually and whoever's in person is enjoying the rest of the conference as well. Okay, I think we should go ahead and start. So once again, this is the panel on exploring decoloniality and peace building, and we have two presenters this afternoon. Duncan Donahue from the University of Notre Dame, followed by Leah Rachel Aria from Ulster University. Each of them will have 20 minutes to present, and then we welcome your questions and comments after those presentations. So please go ahead, Duncan.
All right, thank you. I will share my screen here. All right, here we go. Yeah, so thank you all for coming today for me to present some of the research I've been doing over the last year. My name is Duncan Donahue. I'm a graduating undergraduate senior at the University of Notre Dame. And this research was done as part of my Peace Studies capstone project. So all Peace Studies majors at the University of Notre Dame have to complete a senior research capstone. And so for mine, I wrote on theorizing the intersection on stolen land, critical reflections on intersectionality and Indigenous resurgence. So I thought I would start with sort of my guiding question for this research, which was what tensions and possibilities for the improvement of intersectionality emerge from an engagement with Indigenous resurgence as a school of thought and action. Further, how might these insights contribute to a reflexive critique of intersectionality as a critical social theory in the making? So I was really inspired by Patricia Hill Collins' work on intersectionality, talking about how intersectionality, as it's become such a buzzword in many ways in the academy, runs the risk of being watered down and becoming just another empty buzzword with an unfulfilled potential. But we're at a critical moment right now in terms of intersectional scholarship and also intersectional practice for looking at how intersectionality can continue to be sharpened and become a critical social theory for use in liberatory projects, both in the academy and outside. So before I go any further talking about how I sort of went about researching this question, I thought it would be important to give a little bit of personal background on myself. So I am a white settler whose home was originally Sauk and Fox Indigenous land. And through the ripple effects of colonization, that eventually became Ojibwa land, many of whom still live nearby under the sovereign authority of the Isabel Chippewa Nation. I currently live and reside and study on land that belongs to originally the Pokagon band of the Potawatomi, who currently now live in Dowagiac, Michigan. And I came to this project through undergraduate coursework and study with Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald at Notre Dame, and coursework on the relationship between different systems of power, particularly having to do with race, in the context of North American settler colonialism. So looking at intersectionality and Indigenous resurgence as two sort of critical knowledge projects that both emerged within North America, but understand race and its relationship to power and other systems of power very differently. And so today I'll talk about a section of my research, particularly two concepts that emerge from Indigenous resurgence, and how those concepts can speak to potential areas of colonial or otherwise violent applications of intersectionality, and how intersectionality and scholars of intersectionality and practitioners of intersectionality can avoid falling into those pitfalls. So I'll give a little bit of background on Indigenous resurgence. So Indigenous resurgence is a term that sort of loosely collects a bundle of writers, activists, organizers, scholars, largely in Canada, but also in the United States, that sort of share some central tenets in looking at the current state of settler colonialism in North American settler states, and sort of the way forward for Indigenous peoples. So within Indigenous resurgence, there is a large focus on cultural resurgence. So this idea that the violences of settler colonialism are not over, they're not a past event, and that the way to sort of combat those is through the revitalization of Indigenous cultural practices, such as language, naming, and certain place-tied practices. There's also a rejection of sort of recognition-oriented politics, drawing a lot on the work of Frantz Fanon. They argue that sort of seeking multicultural solutions or recognition within the settler state or truth and reconciliation commissions, all these things sort of legitimize the sovereignty of the settler state and the claim that Indigenous peoples are just another ethnic group, just another visible minority, as it's termed in Canada, and seek to erase the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and the particular relationship that they have to their land in North America. And lastly, there's a big focus praxeologically on the building of alternative nations. So controlling the land, asserting sovereignty, and then having sort of this cultural resurgence within that very land-based and nation-building focused set of practices, such that there's not sort of this overarching settler state that can sort of still legitimate who is an Indigenous, a recognized federal tribe or anything like that. Also within Indigenous resurgence, there is a very strong and particular understanding of decolonization. Many of y'all might be familiar with the article by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And that journal that was published in, and sort of the initial piece in Decolonization and Indigeneity, Education, and Society, is one of the core journals and collections of writings for what is sort of lumped together as Indigenous resurgence. So this understanding of decolonization from Tuck and Yang is very much land focused. Okay, so decolonization is not, making things more inclusive or removing references to settlers. Decolonization is about returning land to Indigenous peoples, and not just in title, not just in memoriam, but returning all of the land materially. And further, it's this article and the work of Tuck and Yang and other Indigenous resurgence thinkers makes it very clear that the settler colonial context in North America is very unique, and that it's not, the internal colony, as they were, empire, settlement, and internal colony have no spatial separation. It's a site of chattel slavery as well as settler colonialism. And there's sort of contradictory decolonial desires because of that, because of this sort of interrelated nature of these different violences pushing in different directions. So the two concepts that I'm really going to focus on for my research today and talking about the relationship to intersectionality are grounded normativity, which I'll talk about in a sec, and also the idea of incommensurability, which comes from Tuck and Yang. So grounded normativity comes mostly from the work of Glenn Coulthard, who is pictured there on the right. He is Yellowknives Dene and an associate professor of political science and First Nations and Indigenous studies, and Leanne Beresamosake Simpson, who is a Mississauga Anishinaabeg scholar, writer, and artist who currently resides in what is called Ontario. And grounded normativity, let's see here, Coulthard defines grounded normativity as the modalities of Indigenous land-connected practices and long-standing experiential knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements with the world and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. And our, in this context, refers specifically to Indigenous peoples. So grounded normativity is, a set of ethical commitments and understandings of the world that is specifically land-based and tied to the, ancestral and traditional ties to land that Indigenous peoples have, and how those factor into their understandings of the world, and not just the physical world, but very importantly, the social world, and who is an actor in that social world, and what is the line between, an agent and not an agent? What is alive and what is not? Coulthard also writes that place is a way of knowing, of experiencing, and relating to the world and with others. So this can sort of speak to intersectionality or problemize certain aspects of intersectionality in two ways. First, I argue in my research that it points toward the need to theorize physical location as an axis of power. And what I mean by that is thinking of place within intersectional thought, not just as a function of other systems of power, such as race, gender, and class, but actual physical location as something that is operative within systems of power and affects the way in which those systems of power operate and distribute resources and life chances. And not only physical location, but also varying relationships to those physical locations. So Coulthard and Simpson's analysis demonstrates that social relationships cannot be understood apart from place for the Diné and the Anishinaabe, but I would argue that place plays a very different role for non-Indigenous peoples within settler states, but it's still critical for understanding the social relationships of those settlers, of those non-Indigenous settlers to the overall sort of social world, if that makes sense. Because I am a settler, that is an aspect of my whiteness that is not captured fully within whiteness. If I were to go back to, Southern Germany, where my ancestors are from, I would still be white, but in that context, I would no longer be a settler. And that's a relationship to place that cannot really be subsumed within, that's a relationship to power and an aspect of power that cannot be subsumed within race, gender, and class. The second thing that grounded normativity sort of points us toward is the need for intersectionality to develop a greater sensitivity to cosmological difference. Now, cosmology refers to a common framework in which to understand place, personhood in the world. It is sort of the framework from which you understand what the world is. So grounded normativity is an example of cosmology. And the way in which intersectionality can better navigate cosmological difference is for scholars and activists using intersectionality who are non-native to understand that they are often using that within a hegemonic Western scientific understanding of the physical and social world and locate themselves within that cosmological vision rather than assuming that intersectionality can operate through this sort of social scientific objectivity and speak to the reality of the social world within Indigenous communities using the tools of intersectionality. So recognizing the bounded nature of intersectionality as a tool that has emerged from the Western episteme and cosmology, as opposed to this objective social scientific tool that can be used to analyze all social situations. The second concept is incommensurability. So this emerges from the work of Eve Tuck and Kei Wen Yang. And ethic of incommensurability refers to the fact that with regards to decolonization as a matter of material land, it recognizes what is distinct and sovereign for projects of decolonization in relation to human and civil rights-based social justice projects. There are portions of these projects which simply cannot speak to one another, cannot be aligned or allied. We can make these notations to highlight opportunities for what can only ever be strategic and contingent collaborations, and to indicate the reasons that lasting solidarities may be elusive or even undesirable. So this ethic of incommensurability recognizes that we might not all be going to the same place. They give the example in their work of reparations in the United States after the abolition of slavery, in which newly freed peoples were promised 40 acres of land and a mule. And that sort of is a rallying cry for reparations even to this day. But within sort of that framework, that looking for a form of rightful restitution, we have the issue of whose land is actually being repatriated, right? So looking at the ways in which fighting for what might be justice in one part of this complicated, contradictory settler colonial matrix might actually not be reconcilable with land back, right? And even today, even if we're not talking 40 acres and a mule, the pieces of the economic engine have been built on stolen Indigenous land. And in terms of redistributing those, like, can we give land back while also redistributing the wealth of that land to people who are non-Indigenous? And it creates these fraught situations which we can navigate through, as what Tuck and Yang say, strategic and contingent collaborations, while realizing there are some parts that will simply never be able to be aligned because they're contradictory. Now, I take this and look at how it applies to intersectionality's understanding of coalitional praxis, and how intersectionality scholars look at the idea of coalition building through intersectionality as one of its main benefits. Now, one thing that emerges a lot throughout the literature on intersectionality is this idea that intersectionality highlights places for coalitions, because once we see how different systems of power relate intersectionally, then we can sort of see, how then different struggles are linked together and all sort of fighting the same, intersectional system of power, how racism and sexism cannot really be understood separately and have to be understood together and fought together. Now, what incommensurability offers for that is that we might not, different projects might not actually be targeting the same matrix of power in a way that is commensurable, right? So if you're not targeting the same matrix, it might not be possible to actually link sort of all struggles against oppressive systems of power through an intersectional analysis. And so sort of tampering down a little bit on the optimism that an intersectional analysis of identity or of power can necessarily, overcome that gap, is sort of necessary in the face of, Tuck and Yang's argument about incommensurability. And the second aspect that I think, where incommensurability can speak to intersectionality is in terms of this idea of coalitional identity. And this comes out especially in the work of Anna Karastasis, who argues that each person's identity within intersectionality can be understood as an internal coalition. For example, womanhood sort of being aligned with Blackness for Black women on an individual level, and how that can serve as a blueprint for broader coalitions. However, what incommensurability suggests is that, well, if certain projects really aren't commensurable with others, if they aren't reconcilable, if they aren't necessarily working towards the same end, then this understanding of people as being sort of made up of these internal coalitions doesn't necessarily apply across all lines of difference. For instance, for Indigenous women under an ethic of incommensurability, it doesn't make a lot of sense to presume necessarily that there's an internal coalition going on between an unraced womanhood and indigeneity. And rather that, intersectionality should not assume that there is sort of a finite or separable nature to things such as gender or race or class, rather that all these things are much more entangled, infused, rather than sort of separable and then able to be put back together into these coalitions. Sorry, clicked off. Yeah, and believe that is 15 minutes. So thank you very much. And feel free to ask me any questions if anything was unclear in that, and also contact me afterward if you'd like. My email is there on the screen. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Duncan. May we now hear from Leah?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So good evening from Northern Ireland. It is an honour to have the opportunity to discuss my research with you today and to follow on from so many rich and thought-provoking presentations that we've seen in this conference. And I'm very grateful to the conference committee for providing this opportunity and for their kind support in facilitating my contribution from this side of the Atlantic. So I will be discussing repression, rights and remedy today in the context of realising social justice as remedy by the delivery of a standalone Irish Language Act to recognise, protect and fulfil human rights of those who have the language and for whom it represents an important element of their identity and their being. I often comment that not only is the topic of human rights both contentious and multifaceted in Northern Ireland, by which I mean it carries different connotations for different communities in our society, but also contending with human rights and understanding who exactly bears responsibility for their implementation and protection is equally as prolonged and problematic. And indeed, the matters of human rights violations and redress in Northern Ireland occupy a very curious cycle. It's a cycle which has repeated itself throughout the history of the province. And it's this focus on temporal and spatial awareness, which is glaringly apparent in a discussion of the deliberate repression of the Irish language and the need to achieve social justice for its speakers. Before I start my presentation, I would like to provide a fun fact about how language itself is perceived in Ireland, North and South. The dominant language across the island is English, but a specific dialect known as Hiberno English. And this dialect is essentially a presentation of the grammatical rules of Irish in English form. So Irish will invoke the speaker's connection to objects or experiences. We don't say, I have a cold, but rather, I have a cold on me. When referring to languages, we will discuss how someone has many languages or have many languages, but not that they speak many languages. So in Irish, and therefore Hiberno English, language is more than just a spoken script. To have a language is to hold the experiences of that language and the generations of its users, to have a sense of identity and of itself, to have an understanding of your place in society and the history of the land. So indeed, to have a language is to have a culture and to have a connections to others within that culture. And this is important to understand in the context of the oppression of a language, to render someone unable to have that language and therefore unable to have that sense of self and that sense of identity and access to culture. So my paper today details how within the space of cultural rights and recognition in Northern Ireland, the Irish language has arguably endured prolonged systemic legislative discrimination under successive unionist governments since the establishment of partition. And it's being posited by scholars such as McNamara and O'Reilly that this approach was part of a wider policy pathway of effective systemic state repression of Irish nationalism and its corresponding cultural expressions, such as the Irish language, by providing preferential legislative direction to the political and cultural priorities of unionism. And my presentation today arises from my wider PhD research, in which I'm submitting the adherence of successive British governments to constitutional conventions has resulted in the hindrance of the protection of minority language rights standards in Northern Ireland. And there has been prolonged inaction by successive British governments and Northern Irish executives, and this has stemmed from that politicalisation of the Irish language as a way of showing preferential treatment to unionism, but also the issue arising of what I've termed constitutional colonialism, where there is that preferential legislative direction on the basis of cultural identity. So I will just share my screen. So just briefly, some things about myself. I am a PhD researcher at Ulster University. I have a law degree from Queen's University Belfast. I hold a master's in conflict transformation and social justice, where the findings of my PhD research start to come through. I was a member of a student working group on human rights, analysing the need for a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland. I also hold a master's in violence, terrorism and security, and I have previous employment experience in political policy and parliamentary monitoring and wider research. So indeed, in my wider PhD research, the dominant argument I'm proposing is constitutional conventions established by historic and contemporary devolution settlements in the history of Northern Ireland have played that role in the non-advancement of language rights standards here, and very much in stark contrast to other jurisdictions in the United Kingdom. And I'm saying that this is due to the strict adherence by successive British governments, irrespective of their obligations under international human rights law to ensure compliance with treaty standards. But yet those same conventions actually seem to have been utilised by successive Scottish and Welsh governments to further the advancement of minority language rights in their jurisdictions. And as I've been undertaking my PhD research, it's become very apparent that the protection and promotion of language rights, firstly, is a complicated matter in the UK due to its multinational nature. And McSaffley has noted the UK as a whole has addressed some, but certainly not all, language policy issues. And that's quite stark compared to the UK's obligations under international human rights law. And it's obvious that progress in the protection and promotion of minority language rights has primarily come through the devolved jurisdictions, particularly in the continued absence rather, of UK-wide legislation on the subject. And as you can see in my slide here, there are operational legislative frameworks and corresponding strategies for minority languages in Wales and in Scotland. So, for example, the Welsh Language Act of 1993, the Gaelic Language Act of 2005. Now, it's important to note these statutes and the strategies are not perfect. They are not operating on a human rights-based approach. They're very much planning and administrative models that don't take into account the wishes of the users of these languages and their communities. But there still has been notable advancement in accordance with international human rights law. And that is therefore revealing the stark contrast with the situation in Northern Ireland. So the absence of Irish language legislation is even more apparent when we consider the inclusion of protection and promotion of the Irish language and the recognition of the need for legislative protection included within a series of peace and political agreements in the history of Northern Ireland over a period of 20 plus years. There were legislative protections in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement of 1998 to recognise linguistic diversity, specifically the Irish language. In the St Andrews Agreement in 2006, there were commitments made by the British government to legislate for an Irish Language Act, a standalone Irish Language Act. And this was fairly replicated in the Stormont House Agreement of 2014. And more interesting enough, most recently in 2020, there were new provisions made under the New Decade, New Approach, and actually had a draft language bill published in conjunction with that agreement. Now, 2 years have passed since then, and no bill has been introduced to the Northern Ireland Assembly.
Leah, sorry to cut you. We're not seeing your slides, so if you can.
Okay, in that instance, because I'm conscious,
it's not advancing. We can only see the title page.
Okay. I apologize for that. I'll just continue, and what I'll do is I'll share my presentation slides later on, and hopefully people can see that. I apologize. I can't even see the chat function, but thank you, Jeremy, for that. So just in terms of the aims of this paper, I was really trying to understand what has caused this glaringly obvious gap in the protection and promotion of the Irish language through legislation and policy compared to the other administrations in the UK, and also understanding what is being perpetrated and entrenched binary divisions and politicalisation affecting the Irish language, and to try to understand if there is a sense of the othering of the Irish language and the users of those people who have Irish. And I was going to understand this through conducting content analysis of historic Hansard reports from the UK Parliament to see what exactly has been said and what has been framing the language. And essentially, I want to send the message that legislation is not just about upholding international human rights law or indeed the commitments in successive political agreements. It's more than that. It's about understanding decades systematic repression, and that legislation is a form of remedy for social injustice. Therefore, legislation is a remedy to advance social justice. So by way of some context, because contextualization is key, in January 2017, the then Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Martin McGuinness, announced his resignation, and this was primarily due to a financial crisis known as the RHI crisis. But a prominent factor that was involved was the ongoing failure of the devolved institutions to legislate for the protection and promotion of the Irish language and the rights of its speakers. And indeed, it actually featured very heavily in the subsequent 3 years of political stalemate where the devolved institutions did not sit. And I would also argue that Mr. McGuinness's resignation was influenced by a decision made by an executive colleague just 1 month earlier in December 2016. And it was a decision that the Equality Commission of Northern Ireland termed as sectarianism in decision-making. The Department for Communities, led by the Unionist Minister, Mr. Paul Given, announced the withdrawal of LEFA funding. LEFA is an Irish language scheme that primarily works to help young people in socio-economically disadvantaged areas learn Irish. And it was for a sum of £50,000, and the department argued this was needed to be withdrawn for efficiency savings. But it caused great consternation, particularly because it was issued on the 23rd of December, and it was a very curt message that actually wished the recipients a Merry Christmas. It was also causing further outrage when it emerged the department was still going to continue its funding of wind and pipe bands that are seen as connected to loyalist and unionist culture and symbols of identity. So grassroots organisations promptly began a series of protests, and those series of protests were covered in the national media, and it continued into the snap election of 2017. Now, the entrenched rejection of Irish and its view as the other by the unionist political mainstream became very apparent during that election campaign, when the leader of the DUP, Arlene Foster, when asked about would the party actually ever legislate for an Irish Language Act, responded, "If you feed a crocodile, it would keep coming back for more." And these comments generated great hurt and consternation among Irish-speaking communities. They perceived the comments as dehumanising and insensitive, and they actually had their activists wear crocodile costumes for the remainder of the campaign. And I think it's important to note this absence of Irish language rights in Northern Ireland was not new by 2017. The protracted issue of adoption of legislation and a corresponding strategy had divided successive Northern Ireland executives. And when policy projects were initiated, they were met with infighting among the executive and ultimately failed. And in April 2016, Conran na Gaeilge issued judicial review proceedings against the Northern Ireland Executive after it failed to implement its Irish language strategy 2015 to 2035. And the High Court in 2017 found in favour of Conran na Gaeilge and held that the Northern Ireland Executive had breached its duty under the Northern Ireland Act and had failed to recognise its legal obligations to promote and protect the Irish language. And I'm conscious this might be difficult because it's not on your screen, but there is a slide that denotes this. Between 2017 and 2019, there were no functioning devolved government in Northern Ireland. And at this time, the British government was actively urged to intervene to directly legislate for an Irish Language Act to ensure the rights of the speakers of the language. But the British government rejected these proposals and affirmed what was called the Sewell Convention, whereby it stated this human rights matter was under the providence of the Northern Ireland Executive, and the British government could not intervene. And there is a quote that I have lifted through my content analysis that's on this slide. It's from the former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, where she explains it's a devolved matter and therefore we cannot get involved. But the Committee of Experts for the European Charter, a very important legal instrument for language rights, disagreed with this affirmation and stated during its fifth report that in the absence of devolved institutions, it was ever more important for the British government to intervene to uphold its own international obligations and to legislate for the Irish language. And as we've seen, that the restoration devolved government has not proved fortuitous for the protection of the Irish language, despite that 2020 agreement I referenced earlier. And in June 2021, the British government pledged that they would actually not abide by the Sewell Convention if the Northern Ireland Executive didn't themselves not bring forward a bill to legislate by autumn 2021. The British government would bring forward an Irish language bill. But as of today, April 22, no bill has been forthcoming. And should we be surprised by the inaction of successive executives and their divisive approach, which has marginalised and oppressed Irish speakers? And should we be surprised by the failure of successive British governments to uphold their obligations? History tells us not to. History tells us this is just that cycle that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The failure to protect and promote human rights, whether from local government or centralised government, is a historic one. And during the civil rights movement here in the 1960s, the Labour government asserted human rights matters were under the providence of the local government and they themselves could not intervene. And this is despite the fact that the Prime Minister Harold Wilson, active during the time of the civil rights movement, actually published in his own diaries in 1974, he recognised that human rights resolved with the British government. The British government had the final say in human rights commitments and protections. And this also applies to the context of Irish language rights, because the failure to intervene from successive British governments has proved disastrous for Irish language rights within the sphere of cultural rights recognition protection. It's been argued by scholars like McInerney that the Irish language has retreated in the face of systemic legislative discrimination and state repression under successive unionist governments since the creation of Northern Ireland. And these scholars, O'Reilly, O'Creardon, and McInerney, have outlined how this was part of a wider policy pathway of systemic repression of Irish nationalism and its cultural expressions such as the Irish language. Andrews has explored that by providing preferential legislative direction to the political and cultural priorities of unionism. Successive historic unionist governments sought to erode or even erase cultural expressions of nationalism and, by extension, Irishness in Northern Ireland. And this preferential legislative direction or pathway undertaken by successive unionist governments was described as effective state repression of the language. And the beginning of this legislative erosion of the Irish language commenced with marginalisation through education, with the passage of the Education Act of 1923, which actively curtailed the teaching of Irish and the hours which could be allocated to teaching of Irish, and subsequent decisions to cease government funding for teaching of Irish. Subsequently, there were policy initiatives which undermined the operation of Irish language clubs and networks. And this led to the description of state education and learning as being unionist in ethos and assimilationist in orientation, whereby British identity was cultivated to the detriment of exploration of Irish identity and culture. And such legislative actions and policy making has served as a mean of cultural exclusion, and efforts to gain legitimacy for the Irish language appears to have been perceived by successive Stormont governments as undermining British cultural hegemony. So it's been suggested in scholarship that the Irish language was perceived in political terms and its propagation was considered a threat. And again, I apologize because you can't see this on my presentation, but I conducted content analysis from the 1920s at the beginning of partition of Northern Ireland to try to ascertain the scope of this sense of othering and of cultural exclusion of Irish. And what I have found is that the politicalization of the language was propagated by that agenda of political unionism, but there was also a cultivation of fear of the sense of the erosion of British identity and British Protestant unionist identity. And that fear instigated unionist politicians, and you will see if you can access the slides, to actively speak in both houses of the Parliament, to criticise the use of the Irish language, to make British identifying Protestants fear for their jobs and their livelihoods. If Irish was prioritised, there was a myth being driven that if you could not speak Irish, you would lose your house and you would lose your employment. So that then leads to this very clear political agenda to promote the culture and identity of unionism and Britishness, and to actively repress the culture of nationalism and Irishness. And this has been continued to this day for those case samples as above. And that is why I would posit that an Irish Language Act is simply imperative, because it's not just about upholding international human rights obligations or the commitments of successive political agreements. It's more than that. It's to try to show absolution for what has been a clear policy agenda to actively repress and erode the language and its culture. So I'm happy to take any questions, and apologies again for the presentation, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I think we'll have a chance to upload your presentation later in the app so that we can look at it after the presentation. Any questions from our guests and attendees? I think you can type in the chat, or there's also a Q&A box here that can see questions. If you have any, feel free to write them so that our speakers can address your questions. Maybe I can start. So to both of Duncan and Leah, kind of a general question on what do you see as next steps? Okay, what is that? Sorry, timer. Yeah, so the question is kind of next steps for Duncan. Where do you see the intersectionality and Indigenous resurgence happening? Is it happening? Is there a potential for that in real empirical terms? If you have seen examples or looking at particular examples of where we can generate ideas and political action on intersectionality and Indigenous resurgence. And for Leah, kind of the not really future, but the political actions around the legislation. You've talked about a lot of the legal barriers and also some opportunities to kind of support the legislative process. I'm wondering if there are extra legislative processes happening as well, either to mainly to support the legislation of the Irish language.
Yeah, I guess I can start. So I think of sort of next steps. I think the next steps for non-Indigenous students and practitioners of intersectionality, like myself and my personal organizing work, I think it really comes down to making sure that your intersectionality is amenable to projects of decolonization rather than attempting to do a project of decolonization myself. I'm not Indigenous. That is not like my role, right? My role is to be an ally and stand in solidarity with projects of decolonization. I think the best way, based off of my readings and study of Indigenous resurgence thought and thinkers, is to stand back and reevaluate a lot of the tools that we use in our projects, in our organizing projects, and in our academic projects. And that's what my project was an attempt to do. And I think that comes down to a further process of just examining sort of the way in which you're situating your academic work and your organizing work, as well as just continuing to listen, right? As Indigenous communities offer often different things. You know, Indigenous resurgence is the one school of thought relating to decolonization, and it shouldn't be taken as the end-all be-all of Indigenous thought. So that was a lot of different things with not a lot of concrete steps, but I think it's a matter of just continuous self-reflection and collective reflection.
And thanks very much for your question. It's a very complex one because in terms of any future political actions that could be undertaken to have any type of progression for a standalone Irish Language Act, it's few and far between. And for many who work in the field of minority language rights in Northern Ireland, we're very cynical at this rate because we feel, what more can we do? When we did see the British government make that commitment last summer, where it actively reversed its position on the Sewell Convention and said that it would directly legislate, that was a seismic moment. I can't understate that was a seismic moment. And so the months ticked down to autumn 2021, and there was the expectation a bill would be forthcoming. And as I've said, it's April 2022 and no bill has been forthcoming. We're in the middle of an election at the minute in Northern Ireland, and we should have a new executive return in June. But the political situation is so unstable and so fraught with tension and division, it's actually quite unlikely we will see the restoration of devolved government. So it looks very dim, is the essential answer to that question. And following on from the British government's intervention, if we do not have devolved government returned after our May election, we would have to have direct rule from London. So whether or not that's then the avenue, the opportunity for direct legislative intervention, I don't know, but history tells us it probably won't happen, and we'll just have continuation of the marginalisation of Irish language speakers and their rights in Northern Ireland.
That's really unfortunate. Also, if you have questions, Duncan and Leah, you can also ask each other and can have this as a kind of that kind of conversation. Yeah, the future is grim, is not very, it's very unfortunate. But I was also wondering to that last point that you said, and going off on what Duncan was saying about allyship and how can we be better allies to each other. And considering the theme of our panel on decoloniality and also colonialism, I was wondering, what does that look like, right? For allies in London, who are they? Where are they? Are there allies in London for such a thing as legislation for Irish language? And how can we, is that a path for us to take? Your presentation is really making me think of that. And also your question, Duncan, really of how can we be allies to a decolonial project while also taking the lessons from intersectionality with us. I would say it's a hard question, and being ally is different for each one of us, not just individually, but depending on the communities we're part of, and also the kind of the political interests that are either promoted or hindered by these actions. Again, if you have questions, you can, please use the Q&A function, or if you have a comment in any of the presentations, feel free to put them in the chat box. Again, Duncan and Leah, if you have questions for each other, feel free to also articulate if you have any. I was also, maybe people are still thinking about what they would, collecting their thoughts on your really dense presentations. Duncan, you mentioned that Indigenous resurgence is only one modality of political thought and action. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the other ways that Indigenous communities are kind of grappling and articulating these ideas around possible potential action and other modes of living, if any. I know Indigenous resurgence is a big topic in itself already.
Yeah, I think that, Indigenous resurgence, right, is a lot, it's a collection of scholar activists, right? And so it doesn't try to represent sort of like the median opinion of Indigenous people in the United States and Canada. And I think, there are lots of approaches to Indigenous people's relationships with, the governments of the United States and Canada that, cannot just be summed up within Indigenous resurgence, but also I don't think can be very easily just sort of amalgamated into, Indigenous communities also might think this or this. I think it's important to remember that even with things like the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock, there were members of the Standing Rock Sioux who wanted the pipeline because of their opinions on oil pipelines and so on. And, no community is hegemonic. Indigenous people are people, right? They have their own opinions on things. And this just represents sort of one cross-continental strain of thinking that has sort of emerged in these scholar activist networks.
Also taking into account that, as you said, place and physical location is a very important axis of power. I think, is that what you call it, right? In our kind of trying to take into account all the different power dynamics that is happening simultaneously as well, not just in North America, but also if we cross, right, to, for example, Northern Ireland, and if we even cross the Pacific, I'm sure it's there could be a lot of discussion that we could generate along those themes of how can we be better coalitional counterparts in these types of movements. But also I'm interested, Leah, in your it's so sad that we cannot see your slides. You mentioned really, I think, provocative quotations, such as the one in the crocodile, and you were talking about the infighting in 2017, and that in other words resulted in the failure of the administration to enact legislation. I may have missed it, you may have said it, but I was wondering, what are were there no legal consequences at all for that failure to uphold the obligation on the part of the government, or did people just ignore? Or I don't know if ignore is the proper term for it, but what is the immediate kind of consequence of that failure? Or did people go to jail, or were they ousted, or what?
Oh, it's an interesting one. Whenever the avenue of legal proceedings are taken, whenever it's judicial review, so whenever the government's decisions are reviewed, essentially all the High Court can do here is just say that the obligations were not met, and therefore it's implied that the government or successive government must rectify that failure. And what's actually happened in Northern Ireland is that when it comes to, there was that judgment I said in 2017 from the Conran Gaeilge case, around the failure to bring forward a legal strategy, and the High Court found in favour of Conrad na Gaeilge, nothing happened, and nothing has happened since. And I think what probably helped unionism is that period of time from 2017 to 2020, we didn't know how to evolve government. So even if people demanded a strategy, there was no government to bring forward that strategy. But even last year, Conrad na Gaeilge brought forward a fresh legal challenge to say, well, we're now so many years on and nothing has happened. And that legal challenge will probably be obscured by any other political shenanigans that take place here, particularly after the May election. And that just really is the story. Like, that's why I said at the start of my presentation, we have this very strange cycle in Northern Ireland where it's human rights violation, failure to act to resolve it, failure to act to international human law obligations. People will protest, there'll be an organised movement of some description, calls for the British government to intervene, they don't intervene, and the situation escalates and becomes worse. And that just is the history of Northern Ireland when it comes to human rights violations in a nutshell. And it's very frustrating when you do take the appropriate avenues, you lobby politicians, there are legal avenues, and nothing comes forward. But you made a very good question about allyship and coalition building. And what's very interesting is that there have been efforts to create a coalition among other politicians in the House of Commons and House of Lords, but they haven't proven to be as successful as coalitions for other rights-based issues. We recently changed our law for abortion, so reproductive healthcare rights, for example. That had to come through the UK Parliament, and there was a very strong mobilisation of Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat MPs working to advance these rights. That's not present when it comes to the Irish language, and I do think that comes from the fact it's such a political situation, it's so contentious, and it stems from that othering that's been in existence for about 100 years.
Yeah, you were also towards the end of your presentation talking about the content analysis you did since the 1920s of how fear is primarily mobilized as a kind of way of othering. It's really very fascinating how language could be central in our political lives as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed your presentations. I guess for me, what I will take away from Duncan is the primacy of place, and from Leah is at the very basic level, right? Primacy of language, or being able to communicate to each other. And if we take them seriously, take both place and language seriously, we can kind of see opportunities for decolonial praxis. Yeah, if Caroline and Twyla has any questions or comments for our speakers, feel free to put them in the chat box, or I believe you can also contact our presenters later on. They have their contact details. I hope you wrote them down, but if you did not, I'm sure you can find them through the virtual platform. Yeah, I guess as a last maybe question, what's next for both of you in terms of your academic trajectory or intellectual trajectory, if you can just share with us so that we can follow you.
Yeah, starting in the summer, I'll be working as a field organizer for Clean Water Action in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And in the fall, I'll be going to Austria for a Fulbright Austria US teaching assistantship. Yeah, and eventually I probably plan on applying to PhD programs in Native studies. Yeah.
That sounds amazing, Duncan. Well done. For me, it'll just be completing the PhD. I'm in the second year of my PhD now. So over here, we try to complete PhDs in 3 years. So I'll be due to submit in September 2023. And then hopefully following on from that, I would love to do postdoctoral research around minority language rights protections and the creation of a proper human rights-based approach in legislative drafting for minority language rights.
Really awesome time for both of you. Really exciting places you will be, and I'm sure like yeah, it's very we're very fortunate to have you here with us and share your projects and interests with us today. Congratulations indeed, and hope to see you around, and feel free to reach out to each other, everyone who is here in this panel on exploring decoloniality and peace building. I guess with that, we'll end, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.